Welcome to this presentation. It's called Conquer Invasive Species, which is going to be presented by John Barber. Mr. Barber has been a citizen scientist for over 50 years and active in green space conservation, recovery of peregrine falcon populations, and the continuing recovery of Eastern Bluebirds. He's now retired after 35 years in the business world, and he's focused on restoring and maintaining biodiversity. He continues studies on bluebirds and passionately performs habitat restoration and ecological gardening of native plants. He served on the Board Nature Center at Shaker Lakes for 10 years, including 2 terms as the board president. He's also co-leading Friends of Lower Lake, which is a program of the Doan Brook Watershed Partnership. He's working to restore habitats around Lower Lake Park in Shaker Parklands.
Good morning, all. I'm John Barber, the co-chair of the Friends of Lower Lake, which is an all-volunteer program of the Doan Brook Watershed Partnership. And thank you for being here this morning. Thank you to the Chagrin River Watershed Partners, and specifically to Kevin Saraceno, a watershed steward at the Partners, for arranging this talk. This presentation is informed by the ecological restoration work now in its 4th year in the Shaker Parklands. And the Shaker Parklands are located in the Doan Brook Watershed Partnership, the Doan Brook Watershed, just a little bit west of the Chagrin River. We're working on about 45 acres, and in doing so, the Friends has logged thousands of volunteer hours over the last 4 years, removed literally tons of invasive plant material, and planted hundreds of native trees and shrubs and flowering plants in the Doan Brook watershed. The talk I'm going to present this morning is intended for both institutional and individual audiences. It's looking at local parklands, city properties, and yards, backyards, front yards. I can't emphasize strongly enough, invasive plants don't draw distinctions among these habitats, and so neither do we. I hope you've received a 2-page handout that Kevin sent to all registered attendees. It goes with the presentation. It includes a lot of plant lists, references, contact information, websites, Facebook pages, and I'll be referring to it throughout the presentation. Titling a talk Conquer Invasive Plants is a little bit of a big bite to take because conquering invasive plants is for all of us, a lifetime task. There's probably no place in any habitat that we've worked where you can do a one and done. You can go in and cut down a lot of invasive plants and then let nature take its course. That can no longer happen. When you remove invasive plants and replant with native plants, you're making a commitment to rebuilding the seed bank and making sure that the invasive plants don't come back ever again. So the sustainability of your efforts is something I'll come back to again and again. The area that we're working in is on the boundary of Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights. It is about a 40-acre lake created when the Shakers dammed the Doan Brook in the 1830s. So on the left of your screen is an earthen and mud rock dam, long since failed from a DNR, Ohio DNR perspective, but it dams up the Doan Brook. The Doan Brook enters from the lower right, flows through Lower Lake, and out the other end, and at the western end of the lake, the upper left end of the lake, the Shakers ran a sawmill based on the water that they backed up in Lower Lake. So we work exactly on the boundary. The lake is split between Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights, and as a result, we have a complex political ecology as well as a complex biological ecology. because we have the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District involved in the flow of the Doan Brook. The Ohio DNR is involved in the safety of the dam and the maintenance of the earthen dam. And then the two cities sit on either side of the lake. So our political ecology is complex as well as the biological ecology. 4 years ago, we joined a work day to remove invasive plants for one day. And we went to the site in the upper left, which was covered in porcelain berry and Japanese honeysuckle, poison ivy, English ivy, a wide variety of species had overgrown this site. And as we began to clear the invasive species, we agreed that we would have to return again and again. And we began putting together a group of volunteers to work with us on a very continual basis rather than a one and done effort where we would only come back once a year. In May of 2018, all we saw was a green mass. By July of 18, we were starting to uncover the foundation of a building. By November of 2018, we'd completely uncovered the foundation of a building. And in the lower right, you see by last June, we had put together a large variety, probably 50 to 75 species of native plants, were well-established trees and shrubs, and we were starting to work our way out from this initial starting point. What was this foundation? Well, the foundation was the foundation of an old canoe club located on Lower Lake, the Shaker Lakes Canoe Club. And this canoe club first put up a building in 1907, put up this two-story building that you see in this screen in 1914. And the building stayed up with an active canoe club until the 1970s, when the building had to come down because, among other things, it didn't have any running water in the building. And the city of Shaker Heights, where this property is located, said in particular that the bathroom buckets could no longer be emptied directly into the lake. The canoe club couldn't afford to put running water in, and folded. The canoe club had a wonderful run for almost 70 years on the lake. They hosted regattas, including 1923, this photograph from 1923, jousting matches, where canoeists would stand on the gunnels of a canoe and try to knock their opponent off. The Rocky River Canoe Club, the Solon Canoe Club. So not only were there races, but there were also jousting contests. And I encourage you, please, don't try this at home. The group of volunteers that we put together were self-selected volunteers. We had a number of people who said, we want to do more than a one-day work day. We want to work in the Shaker Parklands. We walk through the Shaker Parklands all the time. How can we help? And my co-chair and partner, Peggy Spaeth, and I began assembling this volunteer group and understanding how we could remove invasive species and plant native species with a group of volunteers who had a wide variety of interests, a wide variety of skill sets. The only common factor that we had with them, with this group of volunteers, was a very, very high level of enthusiasm for restoring biodiversity in the Shaker Parklands as best we could do. I want to bring up one other point here. The area that we're working in the Shaker Parklands, is an area that has had a high level of human impact on it for over 200 years, from the first tree and plat surveys in 1796 to 1798, all the way up to the present. Humans have been modifying and remodifying the land around Lower Lake. And that leads to the question of what are we trying to restore to when we talk about ecological restoration. And we are not trying to restore back to the gorge of the Doan Brook in 1796 before European settlers arrived. No intention of doing that. Nor were we trying to restore to what it looked like when the Shaker colony, the religious Shaker colony, first dammed the Doan Brook, or restore back to plans in the 1920s, landscaping plans back to the 1920s. Our goal is to say that we understand somewhat what a Northeast Ohio woodland should look like if it has a high level of biodiversity. And we know that by going out to more pristine areas in the Cleveland metro parks, areas along the Chagrin River, areas that haven't had quite such constant human impact, and taking notes on what we see and what's growing there and what's not growing there, and thinking that this is the kind of restoration work that we want to do. So I wanted to put that stake in the ground to say, this is not a pie in the sky idea of going back to pre-European habitat or anything like that. The opportunity for that is long gone. Let's start with some basics. What is an invasive plant? I think we probably all know this, but it's non-native to Ohio, or at least Northeast Ohio, spreads rapidly and aggressively and displaces native flora. That is the key indicator that we have in the area that we're working in, is where monocultures are formed by Porcelain Berry or Japanese honeysuckle, huge tangles of both species of buckthorn. And you say, where are the native plants to Northeast Ohio? They're very hard to find. It's almost impossible to find them in some of the areas we work in because they've been crowded out. There are about 100 species in Ohio that are considered invasive. The Ohio Invasive Plant Council, available on the web, lists this. That list is constantly being updated as we understand, first of all, plants that have been here and we now consider them to be invasive, but also plants that are moving in, like black swallowwort, things like that, that are coming in that haven't been here commonly. This cartoon, sure, it's a bit of an invasive plant, but I haven't gotten any complaints for our neighbors. And of course, here's the neighbor tangled up in the vines. This cartoon always reminds me that it's important to talk about the fact that our yards are part of our watersheds, very clearly part of our watersheds. They feed our watersheds. The watersheds feed our yards through seed dispersal. And I think about the yard here in Cleveland Heights that we have, where we've gone 100% native plants, removed all the grass. It's a wonderful backyard to have, but our yard is surrounded on 3 sides by yards that are comprised almost entirely of privet, English ivy, and invasive euonymus. And so it is an ever increasing task for us to walk the fence line of our yard and prune back the plants that are trying to come through the fence, the ivy and the euonymus and the privet that's trying to come through the fence and reestablish itself. How do invasive plants get here? They get here through the horticultural industry. There are so many plants that were marketed, and in some cases still are marketed, by the horticultural industry as being appropriate for our yards, that then escape, they take over our yards and get out into our parklands and city properties, English ivy being one example. Accidental transport, contaminated soil. For those of you who go out to a new, relatively new shopping development out in Orange called Pinecrest, you will see the garden beds in Pinecrest are now infested heavily with Japanese knotweed, probably because the topsoil that was brought in to plant the garden beds had pieces of Japanese knotweed in them. And this is now coming up through all the plants that were purposefully planted there. Habitat disturbance, roads and trails are a way that invasive species get into different new areas. Birds and other wildlife, raccoons, possums, livestock, horses, pets, all of these are seed dispersers. And all you have to do is look at bird poop or raccoon poop or even dog fur. Our dog is a magnificent seed dispersal mechanism. Water flows, the Doan Brook carries invasive plants up and down it. And we can track specific infestations that started here, and a couple of years later, they were downstream by 100 yards. And then we see a new further infestation further downstream. So water is a great dispersal mechanism. Machinery, bulldozer tracks, truck tires, carry seeds. Humans, certainly we take and deserve a lot of credit for being dispersal mechanisms. The picture on this slide is a extra tough boot tread with a privet seed lodged in it. Who knows where that privet seed would pop out? In what other muddy place would that privet seed pop out? And as a result, at least for our project, we do spend time cleaning boots and tools at the end of every work session to say, don't carry this home with you. Don't carry these things home with you. In summary, plants will move from one yard or park or site to another place, no matter what we say about it. They will move. The best that we can do is try to make it hard for invasive plants to move from one site to another. Why am I being so hard on non-native plants? Well, I think probably most people understand this already, but non-native plants don't support our native insects. And this is critical, and it's so easy to tell. These two photographs show wild ginger on the lower right with holes nibbled out of the leaves, and then the non-native waxy English ivy on the top with absolutely no insect eating it at all. And if you don't feed the insects, then the insects won't live there, they won't thrive there. And if you don't have native insects, then it's going to, first of all, contribute to the insect apocalypse, but it's also going to ensure that our insect-eating birds have less food to eat. And as a result, we'll see the continual decline of our native bird populations. Many flowers and fruits of non-native plants are low or no nutritional value. The example I always like to use is Forsythia. Forsythia produces very little fruit, if any, no nectar, no pollen. It blooms, quote unquote, for two weeks out of the year, and the rest of the time it might as well be plastic. Why do we have Forsythia? Many non-native plants create monocultures. You can just look in yards and see acres or hundreds of yards of English ivy. All that does is provide cover, perhaps, for wildlife, but it certainly provides no food for it. In part, this is because some nurseries act on an economic model, not an ecological one. The example that I grew up with in the Cleveland area is that the big encouragement was to buy annuals on Memorial Day, mulch and spray and fertilize all summer long, and discard on Labor Day. Repeat the same pattern the next year and the year after and the year after. The problem is that if you plant on Memorial Day, particularly plants that don't feed our native insects, you've already missed spring migration coming through. So you've done nothing to help feed the spring warblers and flycatchers and vireos coming through. And if you tear up and discard the plants on Labor Day, you miss fall migration. And so while you think that you're creating a wonderful habitat, perhaps, for our native wildlife, you're completely missing the most important migratory streams coming through in the spring and fall. So what do we do about this? We can do a lot. And I stress that we have so many resources available to us now. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, every county soil and water conservation district in our area, the Greater Cleveland Audubon Society is very active in saying all these groups are resources. And they're saying, we want to help remove invasive plants and replace them with natives. This is an imperative for all of us. And the Chagrin River Watershed Partners are another group. All of the watershed groups, Friends of Euclid Creek, the Donebrook Watershed, all of these groups are very actively involved in managing invasive species. And we can do this and need to do this in our yards, in our city parks, and also in the larger watersheds. How do we do this? Well, the most obvious one is first correctly identify the plant. Before you start cutting things down or tearing things out, what is it that you have? And on the handout that I've given you, there are some places that you can go to identify plants. There are so many fact sheets. Almost every state in the Midwest has invasive plants in Ohio fact sheets with beautiful color pictures and steps on how to remove them, steps to identify them. And that's true in Kentucky and Illinois and Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania. There is so much information available. Go out there and understand how to identify the plants. We're going to cover about a dozen plants in the talk this morning, but please understand your resources are virtually unlimited. And then identify the goals for management. What are you trying to do? In our case, around the lake at least, we're trying to get rid of the worst of the invasive species and replace them with native plants. In our yard, we're trying to get all of the non-native species out. So you have different goals for different habitats, but it's a good thing to identify those goals. A woman coming by one of our work sessions said, do you know that dandelions are non-native? Why don't you eliminate dandelions in Northeast Ohio? And we said, that's not on our list of goals. So it's good to have goals. It's good for them to be targeted because this task is so huge. Choose the best management methods. We're going to talk about that at length today. Choose disposal methods. Please understand, particularly if you're working in parklands, you can create enormous masses of invasive plant material very, very quickly. And the question then is, what do you do with it? We'll talk about that. Always, of course, clean your boots and tools carefully and keep notes. One of the things that our little group of volunteers has found is that we have so much to learn. We can learn from each other. We can learn from experts who come in to help us from the Soil and Water Conservation District, from the Department of Agriculture, from museums. There's so much expertise out there. It helps to keep notes and say, we found this worked, or we found this didn't work. And we are very, very big sharers. That's why we're doing talks like this, is that we're very eager to tell people, get started. Please learn from us. Please learn with us. Please help us. Come join us on Sunday mornings and work with us, because sharing this knowledge will make us all more efficient. If you're working in public spaces, parklands, that are owned by park districts or city properties, church areas, things like that. It's very, very important that you do some preliminary steps. If you look at this photograph here, this is a photograph of the west end of Lower Lake several years ago. And in this picture, please use the street light for scale, there are no native plants. What you're looking at is a massive porcelain berry primarily, although Oriental bittersweet has jumped in, covering trees of heaven. So in this whole picture, there's not a native plant to be seen. And if you think about what will happen when you take all the non-natives out, it's going to be a very stark contrast. But you have to do that to clear the way for native plants. And that's why one of the most important parts to me of working in public spaces is to start outreach and education. And you start with websites, city websites. You can create your own websites. We have a website called ecologicalheights.com where we tell people about our various projects. The Donebrook Watershed Partnership, our parent, talks about various projects. It's very important to tell people we're going to be working here, ecological restoration in progress. Another point is to stop planting invasive species. And this sounds like kind of a no-brainer, but it isn't, because there are people who are constantly looking to improve the beauty of a situation in ways that they think are the best. And one example that we have is that there is a project that's been proposed in the Donebrook Watershed Partnership that includes planting a very large number of fountain grass plants, which have a tendency to become invasive and are banned in a number of Western states now as invasive. Planting them along the edge of this new project, which happens to be the border of the Donebrook watershed. And that's the kind of thing that we want very much to say, this species is becoming invasive. Please don't have it in your landscape plan. Here are some alternatives. We ask people to report invasive species when they see them. This is particularly appropriate for a species like Japanese knotweed, where once it gets established, it's very hard to get rid of it. You want to prepare the public for the removal process. If you could envision this picture without the invasive species in there, it looks very, very bare, and there are lots of small trees and small shrubs, which will grow and grow up quickly. But it's going to be a number of years until this massive greenery is back again in the form of native plants. Prepare the public for it. Talk about ecological restoration, because you want to enlist public support, not just volunteer support, but also passerby support. So what it all comes down to, at least with invasive plants, to me, is kill what, where, and with what. And this always reminds me of the wonderful old game of Clue, the wrench, Colonel Mustard in the ballroom, because removing invasive species requires an approach of identifying each plant, each species that you want to remove, understanding the best way to kill it and remove it, how you're going to do it, and what kind of monitoring has to be done afterwards on a species by species level. We call it planning your attack. This is a photograph that gives me nightmares. It is a patch near Horseshoe Lake in the Shaker Parklands. This man, one of our volunteers, is about 6'2". He is standing in a patch of Japanese knotweed, and this patch of Japanese knotweed hangs over the Doan Brook, and you can see it about to go to seed. It is an enormous patch of Japanese knotweed, very, very hard to get rid of. So when you plan your attack, what do? You prioritize what to remove in the given site. For example, in your yard, it might be most important to you to remove the invasive barberry plants or the invasive privet plants, invasive Norway maples first, and then come back around to some of the ivy. You might clip the English ivy that's growing up your trees, but not remove it from the ground until the spring when the ground is very soft. Prioritize what to remove. There's lots of debate among ecological restoration efforts about where do you start? Do you start in the best habitat to try to preserve what is the best habitat? Do you start in the areas of most risk? This particular habitat is downstream of a large privet patch. Do you begin at the edge and work inwards? Because that's the easiest way to go after multiflora rows. And my answer to that is look at your habitat, talk to other ecological restorers, and say, here's what I think would work best. What do you think? And then set a goal. Where are you going to start? Determine the disposal methods. We're going to talk about this at length, but it's very important to think about that ahead of time before you have an 8-foot high pile of buckthorns that stretches as far as the eye can see, where you've happily cut down and treated buckthorns, but now what do you do with all this material? Emphasizing very strongly, there are safety protocols to follow. Most of these are common sense. You can be sure in Northeast Ohio, most of the ecological restoration sites you work with will have poison ivy. Your volunteers need to be aware of that, and you need to be aware of that. In the late summer, ground bees will be nesting. That is just the way it happens. If you're working on slopes, you probably don't want to be working with untrained volunteers using chainsaws. And so there are all sorts of things that, as you volunteer with existing groups, like the Friends of Lower Lake, you work with safety protocols, and then you can then use them in groups that you may follow. And we also, in many cases, we work with pairing up people, particularly if we're working on steep slopes that lead into the lake, so that nobody is working by themselves in an area where they could get into trouble. This pyramid says, okay, what kind of restoration techniques are we going to use? And again, everybody has their own philosophical beliefs, their own willingness to invest their time over the long haul. So there's prevention. Don't let invasives get established in the first place. And for us, that horse has left the barn. We don't have really any area that we would consider best habitat, because the area has been modified by humans for 200 years. And invasive species, 28 species identified to date in one small area, are very, very firmly established. So prevention for us is out of the question. Cultural sanitation, we don't want more coming in from neighbors' yards or from people who innocently plant something in the parks because they think it would look nice. We do a lot of physical and mechanical removal. That is the biggest focus of our effort, physical and mechanical removal. We don't do any biological removal, which is primarily releasing parasites. And the most common example in Northeast Ohio is purple loosestrife, where there is a parasite of purple loosestrife that can really put the hurt on purple loosestrife. As a little volunteer group, we don't use that. We do use herbicides. We use them very selectively, and we use them very carefully. We have some volunteers who would prefer not to be involved in that, but given the extent of our infestation, we do use some herbicides, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get through it, as we get into this talk. So let's talk about control methods. Residential yards, manual and mechanical. Pull it out, dig it out, overseed, interplant to outcompete. And maybe if you have buckthorns in your yards or Japanese honeysuckle or enormous old barberry, you may want to use chemical treatments. But that is something where you will always want to be sure of what you're doing before you consider that. On larger scale projects in parklands, you use all the same steps that you use in residential yards of manual and mechanical and so on. But you may also add biological. You may have access to the parasites that kill purple loosestrife. You may be able to burn. You may be able to rent goats. There are places in Ohio that will rent goats, fence them in, and let those goats feed on your invasive plants. And you may use different kinds of chemicals that homeowners don't have access to. Mechanical and manual removal. I mentioned it's good for yard infestations. It can be chemical free. It is very labor and time intensive. This photograph here shows two guys working with a tree wrench to dig out buckthorn roots. We have one guy standing around to supervise because that's always appropriate. You can see Lower Lake in the background. One of the things that I think will jump out at you is that we are pulling out one buckthorn stump at a time. And that is a very, very time consuming effort to drag those buckthorn stumps out. And it also does a great deal of disturbance to the soil. As many of you know, invasive species love to regenerate, get reinvigorated. Invasive seeds in the seed bank may erupt back into plants again when the soil is disturbed. So manual and mechanical removal is a big soil disturber, and be aware of that and understand that you'll have to come back again and again and again to make sure that the disturbance you caused hasn't encouraged invasive plants. Once again, there's debris disposal. There's always ongoing maintenance. We are making a commitment to this area for the rest of our working lives because we know that there are so many invasive seeds and invasive roots in the root bank. There's simple pull and dispose, cutting flowers and cutting seed heads off to keep them from going to seed, repeated cutting of new growth. This is something where we have some test areas where instead of digging things out, we're letting plants grow up to about 30 inches tall, cutting them off, and we're going to do this for 5 years. And we think at that point we will have exhausted the root stock. Digging out roots and all is very effective, and we have a lot of gung-ho diggers. But again, it is very disturbing to the soil, which may generate a new growth on the part of invasive species. And when I say generate new growth, we do come back and plant very quickly with native plants. So we're trying to leave as brief a time as possible where there's nothing in the ground, because that's just an invitation for trouble. This orange device is a tree wrench, affectionately named by the manufacturer as the Big Daddy Extractigator, but it is simply a lever that locks on the trunk of the tree. In this case, a cut-off buckthorn trunk, and it locks around, and you then have 1 to 10 leverage multiplier. And particularly in wet soil, you can pull buckthorns and small Japanese honeysuckles, privets, roots and all, by using this extractigator. We do use glyphosate. We use differing concentrations of glyphosate, and we do not spray. We use what's called cut stump treatment. And this is like a roll-on deodorant where, particularly on the old buckthorns, the very, very well-established glossy and common buckthorns, we'll cut it down, and then we will dab, using this buckthorn blaster, we'll dab herbicides around the cut stump for the express purpose of keeping it from resprouting. Other removal tactics, overseed and interplant. You can take, and this is something where we've gotten a lot of support from Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District. You can take large batches of native plant seeds, go out to an area and spread, just literally spread by the wind, native plant seeds at this time of year, in the fall, even in early spring, seeded on top of snow, for the express purpose of saying, we're going to refill the seed bank with native species to outcompete the invasives. There are cases where we use very small propane torches. The example is on the lower right, a species called lesser celandine that we're going to talk about when we get to the specifics is one where we see the best responses from burning with it, always used with caution, of course, water and cell phone. And what do you do with what's removed? we're trying to make it so that we leave the debris to compose in places wherever it's feasible. And that's something just because the cities can't handle invasive material, particularly things like Japanese knotweed, where if you try to compost it, it may just come back. Let's very quickly run through a couple of species. You're all familiar with, I hope, with garlic mustard. Pull the whole plant, bag it. It only comes out in the spring. There is some thought that if you pull it and break the stem, you can leave it on site, but I haven't seen anything conclusive about that. Lesser celandine is rapidly expanding, certainly on the east side of Cleveland. It is, there are tiny tubers deep into the soil, very, very difficult to get rid of. We think maybe that targeted burning may be the best result or the best tool. Japanese knotweed requires, the presence of Japanese knotweed requires disclosure in England. If you try to sell a house that has Japanese knotweed on the property, you have to disclose that, the way we have to disclose lead infestations. And it's just amazing. It is called the concrete cracker because when it grows into bridges or sidewalks, it can crack the concrete. And this is one of the things that we are testing, cutting back to the ground multiple times a year for many years. English ivy grows up trees. It won't go to seed until it grows up a tree, at least, if nothing else, on your property and wherever you can in parks. Cut it at the base. Don't drag it out of the tree. You'll damage the tree. Cut it at the base. If you can treat it with glyphosate to kill the roots, you can do that. But this is a species that is a host for oak wilt, which could be an unmitigated disaster in Northeast Ohio. So we need to get this out of the trees by cutting it at the base. Vinca, we pull it aggressively when the soil is damp, and it is something that we have to pull repeatedly. Japanese barberry, this one is very unsettling because it is associated with an increase in ticks, which of course carry Lyme disease and a whole raft of new bloodborne diseases. And we want to get this out wherever we can. It's very difficult to get out, probably best to cut it and stump treat it. But in your yard, you can dig it out with a digging fork when the soil is moist, and it just needs to be trashed. There are multiple species of privets. Dig them out, pull the smaller ones. We argue that you can leave the debris on site and replace with things like spicebush and cranberry. A number of recommended replacements are on your handout. The bush honeysuckles, new information, and thank you from Kentucky. New information on this is that bush honeysuckles not only outcompete everything that grows, tries to grow under them, but they also have a very detrimental effect on water quality and on the ability of frogs to nest, to reproduce successfully. I think we have at least 4 species in Ohio, maybe more. Cut these down, treat the stumps, and then monitor them to see if they regrow. Common and glossy buckthorn are probably the most common invasives in Northeast Ohio. In every field, at the margins of fields, they try to move into fields. The birds spread the seeds of these 2 species, but seeds from these species cause birds to have diarrhea and probably weaken the birds. So it is something where, again, wherever possible, we want to get these out and certainly get these out of our yards. Porcelain berry is an extremely aggressive vine. You'll see it all through the Shaker parklands. Cut it off at the base, treat the stump where possible, and replace it with woodbine or 5-leaved ivy, anything to prevent the porcelain berry from returning. Winter creeper euonymus covers everything. It's a monoculture. You can pull it out when the soil is moist, but it is an area that you have to then monitor for years until the roots are exhausted. Tree of heaven, mother of millions, is another is another nickname for this. It is known to grow anywhere, very common in urban situations. It is a very hard tree to kill. This is a 70-foot tall specimen in the parklands that has been cut down. And we are revisiting the stump on a regular basis because it continues to resprout even with herbicide treatment. And the roots themselves send out rhizomes. I think 60 feet is the record rhizome for this species, where it then pops up 65 feet away. On the left, the tree has been girdled. You can see right above the sprout a girdle mark. And in 2 weeks, the sprout was 6 feet tall. The mother of millions nickname comes, if you look at the right-hand picture, you see the kind of seed heads that are produced by a mature tree of heaven. So the handout talks about plant this, mimic nature, and there are lists on your handout, on the handout that Kevin was kind enough to send out, not only what to plant in the place of the invasives you remove, but also places that you can find them. There are lots of native vines that you can use that are great replacements for the invasive vines. Native shrubs, this is one that is so important, particularly in watersheds, but also in yards, and so many good native replacements. I'm going to take a minute here to say Doug Tallamy, Bringing Nature Home, who talks all about using native plants to help rebuild biodiversity for the sake of insects and birds, compares how many caterpillars are found on what species of shrubs. In this example, this list that I've put it in front of you, and this is available on the resources page that I'm going to tell you about. Dogwoods will host 118 caterpillar species, and Forsythia will host 1. So in your yards and in your parklands, why would you have Forsythia and Buddleia and Tree of Heaven when you can have dogwoods and viburnums and witch hazels? Native trees, again, looking at the number of species of caterpillars that are hosted on them. Any oak, 534 different species are supported. And then if you go all the way to the other end, the Tree of Heaven, I think Tree of Heaven is 2 or 3 species of caterpillar. So again, if your goal is to increase biodiversity and help reverse the insect apocalypse, plant native. Recruiting volunteers, we talk to passersby at our work sites. We have a postcard that we hand out, and passersby are always curious. What are you doing? Can I help? How can I help? We learn and train together as we work, even socially distanced. We're calling out to each other to say, what do you do about this and what's that species? We work with people of all ages and abilities because there's so many tasks to be done in removing invasives that there's always something for everybody. Some people come and they flip a bucket upside down and they pull ivy, and that is their idea of what a great time to be outdoors. And other people are gearing up with a tree wrench to try to drag invasive buckthorn out of the ground. We do presentations, we have email newsletters, and again, with our volunteers, we are always reminding people of safety protocols. It is seasonal work. In the spring and summer, it's best to remove new growth. Herbicides for cut stump treatment is best used in the fall. There are species that we identify as simply all we're going to do is cut them back year after year, but we are always trying to expand out in the parklands to work in a larger area. So in conclusion, I ask of you, start working now. Find a volunteer program and become associated with it. Talk to your Department of Agriculture people. Talk to your soil and water conservation people. Get to work with the Chagrin River Watershed Partners, Friends of Euclid Creek, the Doan Brook Watershed Partnership, and jump into a volunteer program because it is a fun and very straightforward way to learn how to be an effective remover of invasive plants. Remove them everywhere you can, although I do caution you on taking invasive species out of your neighbor's yards without permission, please don't. Replace them with plants native to Northeast Ohio. And again, the handout will talk about that. And then remember that this is a lifelong pursuit. It's something that you can enjoy your entire life because you have to. There's so many invasive plant infestations with so many different species of invasive plants that we have a lifetime of work ahead of us and a wonderful opportunity to be outside with other like-minded individuals. Monitor, 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 everywhere you go. With that, I do want to draw your attention on the handout, please, for those of you who have it. When you're working in public spaces, the first page of the handout, if you do, excuse me, if you do decide to use herbicides in public spaces, you have to be working with and under the supervision of someone who is licensed by the state of Ohio. And that's why I encourage you to join up with volunteer groups who may have that licensing already taken care of. You don't need to do that at home unless you're working in a wetland, if you have wetlands on your property. But that's something to keep in mind. Again, I want to reiterate, as I say on the handout, how important it is to talk about working in public spaces. On the back side of the handout, I list a book called Invasive Plants of the Upper Midwest by Elizabeth Zarapata. This is an absolutely fantastic reference book to have. Most of our local libraries have copies of it. It is available through local bookstores. That is just a wonderful reference for you to have. I would prefer you have your own copy since it's such a great place to take notes. On the websites, the National Audubon Society has a native plant lookup, what's native plant in my zip code, and the same is true for the National Wildlife Federation, what is native in my zip code. The US Department of Agriculture, fantastic resource, plants.usda.gov, goes down to the county level to say what native plants are available. So these are just a few things. Please email us at thefriendsoflowerlake@gmail.com if you'd like to work with us, if you have questions, and keep an eye because we do put out an occasional newsletter where we talk about other presentations on this same subject. With that, I'm going to stop and turn it back over to Kevin and say to everyone, thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Really appreciate the presentation. Right now, we'd like to go and cover a few questions in the chat. So if anyone has any questions, now is a good time to put them in. If I mispronounce your name, sorry in advance. And sorry if I miss any questions as well as I'm reading through the chat. Here's one from Matt Valentic. He asked, doesn't Tree of Heaven support spotted lanternfly?
Thank you, Matt. Yes, it does. The spotted lanternfly is our next potential emerald ash borer. It has just crossed the line coming westward from Pennsylvania into Ohio. Matt's point is a great one because Tree of Heaven is a preferred host and a familiar host for the spotted lanternfly. And everybody who is asking us to keep an eye out for spotted lanternfly says, when you find it, it's just a matter of when, you're probably going to find it first on Trees of Heaven, which makes me want to go out and kill and take down every tree of heaven I possibly can. Thank you, Matt.
Okay, here's a question from Edward Weber. In developing our property on the margin of Acacia Reservation, they planted an Ohio native prairie mix, but they've been invaded by invasive species and they're running out of energy for the flight. Who can I hire to help me wage the war against invasive species?
And I'm sorry, who can I hire?
Yeah, who can I hire?
First of all, please do continue to talk with the people who manage acacia of the metro parks to ensure that whatever you do is a cooperative effort with them. They've invested millions of dollars in habitat restoration at acacia. Certainly, there are lots of recent college graduates and high school students who are available for hire. You can probably find them through some of the volunteer groups that are working locally. You may want to form your own volunteer group, as a spin-off of an existing volunteer group, the Friends of Acacia Park and Environs. So there are lots of opportunities to do that with the reminder of safety protocols and correct identification are paramount.
Okay, here's a good question. Susie Maurer asked, can goats be used to eat up invasive English privet?
Yes. I have seen places where goats have eaten privet and they have eaten it down to stems that are maybe 3/4 of an inch thick, where they seem to run out of the ability to chew that off. So yes, goats can be used to do that. There are some goat renters who say it's only a matter of how hungry are the goats. They'll go much thicker than 3/4 of an inch, but I haven't seen that.
Okay, Lori Buss asked, what is the impact of topically applied glyphosate on soil?
It's controversial, I think. The Friends of Lower Lake and the other groups that we're involved in don't use glyphosate as a spray. And I think that there may be some short-term impact on the surface fungi or bio-life of the surface of the soil from glyphosate sprayed. I don't know. Cut stump treatment avoids that, which is one of the many reasons we focus on cut stump treatment. But there are places where spraying is appropriate. And I do know that glyphosate is supposed to break down quickly. So I would not, if you have the right application for it and the right concentrate, and you're working following the label, you always want to follow the label, I would use it carefully and try not to saturate the soil.
Okay, Linda Schneider asked, what can I plant as Japanese knotweed is being killed by herbicide along a stream bank? Her concern is that she's going to experience a lot of erosion as the Japanese knotweed is being removed.
In our area, which is on a lake bank where we are cutting the Japanese knotweed back on a continual basis, we are interplanting it with everything from common milkweed to swamp milkweed to senna. We even have some jack in the pulpit in there. We are literally putting everything that we can put in there that would like a relatively dappled sunlight situation, putting in as much as we can to try to outcompete the Japanese knotweed. Your question is excellent. I think that in the case that you're describing, not having seen the habitat, repeated cutting and then interplanting with native shrubs that enjoy wet feet, so I'd get buttonbush in there right away to try to shade the remnants of the Japanese knotweed would be one approach.
Okay, Hope Gumprecht asked, is it okay to chip buckthorn and privet?
Yes, it is. I would encourage instead that you cut it and leave it in place. The question that we have been wrestling with is, what do we do with buckthorn and privet that have semi-ripe berries on it, because we have such an enormous infestation of those two species that we can't get to it all before it goes to fruit. We try to get to the female buckthorns before the males because they are dioecious, and we want to keep those females from going to fruit. But there are times when we do chip it. If we chip it, we leave the chips on site by using them for trails or simply spreading them in the woods. I'd like to re-emphasize here that the area that we're working in, we know that the seed bank is so infested with buckthorn and privet seeds that we have years of monitoring before that seed bank is exhausted. We know that we're going to be taking buckthorn and privet new plants out for a decade or maybe even decades. It's so much easier to remove a newly planted privet and newly planted buckthorn that we'll accept it as ongoing maintenance because we know the seed bank is so infested. For a while, we were clipping and taking the berries off individual privet plants after we took them down, bagging them, and trying to find a place that would accept them as trash. And that is incredibly resource intensive. And so now we're looking at how can we more safely leave things on site and accept the fact that if that buckthorn has been reproducing for 110 years, one more year is not going to make that, of berries, is not going to make that big a difference.
Okay. Leah Osgood asked, can you please repeat the name of the book that you mentioned?
Yes. It is on the handout, Invasive Plants of the Upper Midwest. And the author's last name is Zarapata, C-Z-A-R-A-P-A-T-A. I think it's 3 years old now, and it's wonderful. And by the way, Kevin said that he is going to post the handout. It's on the Friends of Lower Lake website, but it will also be on the Chagrin River Watershed Partners website in their resources section, if for some reason you don't have that.
Amy Golitz asked, what is the best way to dispose of multiflora rose?
The best way to dispose of multiflora rose is to put it in a pile and let it dry out very, very thoroughly. And then I would suggest cutting it up and putting it in your trash quietly. Okay.
Kim Alder asks, can buckthorn be controlled in a meadow with a controlled burn?
A fire will keep newly sprouted buckthorns. I've read places that say up to 4 to 6 feet tall will be killed by a burn. But when the trees are taller than that, you have to go tree by tree because the roots are too firmly established. You may burn the top of the tree and the roots will resprout the next year. So burning has not been effective at killing mature buckthorns in Northeast Ohio.
Okay, next question. Jackie Driscoll asks, since native seeds often take a long time to germinate, do you suggest some type of cover crop after a soil disturbance?
No, I don't. And the reason is that the model that we use is that most of our native seeds have been successfully germinating and reproducing for thousands of years in Northeast Ohio. And we feel as though we could drive ourselves crazy trying to scarify and control temperatures perfectly and control the number of days in a controlled temperature and things like that. And so our tendency is to put more seeds of native plants in a given environment than might occur naturally, but not to go to great lengths to try to baby those seeds, or baby those seeds might not be the best phrase. But we feel that we need to give the seeds, native seeds, some credit for having survived so long. And so we would prefer to leave the natural leaf litter that's there and get seeds scattered, and then just monitor it for the invasives resprouting. But people are going to have their own opinions about that, and it depends on the level of resources that you have.
Okay. Priscilla Jones asks, do you have a good way to eliminate an unwanted grapevine?
I would cut it at the base, and in late fall and winter do cut stump treatment with glyphosate of the base. I would not drag it out of the tree. I would let it wither and die in the tree, because dragging it out of the tree, if it's a native tree, dragging it out of the tree can damage the limbs of the tree. That's a judgment call. There may be too much organic matter in the top of the tree, and you want to pull some of that out. It does not work, in my experience, to dig grapevine roots out. That cut stump treatment or repeated cuttings, if you're not an herbicide user, repeated cuttings where you're monitoring it for years until the root dies back.
Okay, so looks like that's the last of the questions. Is there anything else you'd like to add, John?
Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. Our journey has been one of discovery, and some things 4 years into the project, we continue to discover new things, and it makes it all the more fun. We have a great group of volunteers working. We're continually learning. The example I'll use is that we just uncovered research material that tells us, because we are constantly fighting resprouting white mulberry trees in some of the areas around Lower Lake. And white mulberry trees are very easy to cut down, and they also resprout all along their root for tens of feet along the root underground. And we discovered that the vaunted Shaker religious colony that dammed the Doan Brook and formed Lower Lake, and we're really the first people to do any kind of ecological manipulation in the Shaker parklands, planted white mulberry trees native to China for the express purpose of growing silkworms so that they could manufacture in the 1830s silk stockings. And we, 100 or almost 200 years later, are dealing with the aftermath of what the Shakers brought over as part of their commerce. Who knew? And this is the kind of interesting fact that constantly makes this project exciting. Thank you for your time this morning.